Okay, thank you everyone for your patience. Next up, we've got a fireside chat here on digital ecosystems. So please join me in welcoming Paul Graham and Antony Kagoo to the stage. Welcome, guys. Please take a seat. Okay, now Paul is Director of UK Engineering for MATRIXX Software, which is a Silicon Valley-based company. He's got 28 years of experience in telecommunications and has recently been involved in MATRIXX's transition to adopting cloud-native technologies. Antony is Head of Innovation, Communication, Media and Information Services UK and Europe at TCS. Tony's got more than 15 years of experience in IT and consulting, leading customer relationships across multiple CXO domains with a strong focus on contact center, networks, CFO functions and emerging technologies. He's led innovation for TCS's CMI customers in the UK and Europe regions, evangelizing the art of possible, which I like, art of possible for the industry. So these are your panelists, and Tony, I'm going to turn to you first. So how do you choose best-in-class partners to support the digital ecosystem? And is it a case of buy or build?
Yeah, so when you talk about ecosystems is basically a interconnected set of services which the end consumer or the users end up using or utilizing to do certain jobs, right, that cuts across sectors, cuts across industries. So when we understand the definition of what ecosystem is all about, one of the key things is to understand that ecosystems are complex. They have unfamiliar outcomes because it's still being experimented, tested, and today's large ecosystems are technology companies as well. So once that paradigm is kind of defined and people are aware of what it is, the most important thing is to identify partners who will augment what capabilities you have. That's number one. And number two is the partners who are able to provide digital expertise. Because we will end up creating a lot of things, we will end up buying a lot of things, but the partners needs to fill the gaps in the value chain. And the value chain needs to be seen as a holistic value that we offer to the consumers rather than piecemeal basis. So I think identifying partners is key. Understanding what type of partners needs to come into the ecosystem depends upon what services you want to offer to the customer in the end-to-end value chain. So that is absolutely important, and today the ecosystem is open to basically everybody because of the ubiquitous nature of digitalization, data, analytics, advanced services and emerging technologies as well.
Okay, and talking about partnerships there, Paul, how do you balance partnerships between large-scale organizations and innovative startups?
Yeah, Tony, that's an interesting question actually, because sometimes some of these companies labeled as large incumbents, actually they become so big that they actually form small companies within the large organizations. And the trick is, when dealing with a large organization, look for those small groups, right? Because those small groups, they kind of act like small startup companies. They're sort of their own ecosystems, right? They can be very dynamic. So we're in telco, right? And we deal with those large telcos, monoliths all the time. However, in those large monoliths, there's lots of kind of smaller companies bursting the get out, right? And the advice is go into these large organizations, right? And look for those smaller groups of organizations, the dynamic groups, the ones doing innovation, setting the trend and taking those large companies forward, right? They're the leaders. And don't be too put off. There's the big groups, there's the Vodafones, the Hutchinson. Within those groups, you will find those small, the thought leaders, they're forming small groups, go and work with them. Similarly, right, innovative startups. We're an innovative startup, right? We're MATRIXX, we're a Silicon Valley company. We like to look out there for other similar companies we can work with, right? No inertia, get things done, and it's very important that we also work with those, right? You get the most synergy, you'll get the most business, and we'll move along with them. So large companies, look for those smaller companies within large companies that innovate, and always looking out for those innovative startups who we can do business with. Okay, Tony?
I mean, do you have any examples of that? You mentioned some of the larger organisations like Vodafone, for instance.
Yes.
Can you mention some of the smaller departments or subgroups within those larger organisations, just to give some examples?
Absolutely right. Within Vodafone, you'll find like a group looking at the 5G cloud work like I'm working on, right? And I've hooked up with them a few weeks ago at Cubicon, came across people who were they were in Vodafone. However, they've got that kind of dynamic thought leadership that you need, right? They're not being dragged by the larger group. They're doing that work because, these companies, large companies, they do survive because they need that innovation, right? They recognize it and they set up these small groups to do the innovation. Go and find them, right? Go and work with them and you'll be fine.
Okay, and Tony, staying with partnerships, can you share any experience or advice when it comes to building strong partnerships?
Yeah, I think when we talk about partnerships, one of the key things we want to understand is what is the contribution of the partner within that ecosystem, right? So are we going to buy from them? Are they going to complement with their services? Do we end up co-creating services? So there are multiple dimensions to it when you talk about partners. So in order to build strong partnerships, one of the main things in the digital ecosystem is about having the right governance, operating governance. It's a mind shift that is needed there to drive ecosystem. So it's a cultural thing. It's an impact in the culture. It's an impact in the operational governance. So everything is to be rethought, reimagined. So when you have reimagined on the way you want to work, as a part of that outcome is how do you incentivize partners? How do you kind of bring in partners who will add value to the ecosystem, and what is the value that they're going to get from the ecosystem? So as long as these questions are answered within the operating governance or the operating model we're trying to create, I think the partnership will end up being a lot more stronger, and the scope of each player's or each partner's contribution within the ecosystem needs to be absolutely defined. As a large organization, if I'm going to be an orchestrator of an ecosystem, I need to know where my contributions stop and where does my partner's contribution start, right? How are we going to complement each other? So as long as these elements are fixed within the governance and everybody knows where they're going to play, what type of role, how they're going to do the smart shifts to kind of increase the exponential value, the partnerships automatically become stronger. Weak partnerships happen when things are not kind of defined. A lot of organizations have tried ecosystem and they have failed. A reason being is they do not want to kind of give away the value that they're creating out of the ecosystem. Neither do they want to kind of involve the partner as an equal contributor into the ecosystem. I think these are the questions that will be evolving, experimented on as we go through.
Now, it's interesting, you mentioned there at the start of your answer, you talked about culture, and in the last session, Deepak from JP Morgan, he was talking about the importance of culture as well when it comes to data and AI. So I'd like to hear both of your views on this really. How important is culture and having the right culture when it comes to digital ecosystems?
I think the culture it's one of the key or the foundational pillars of ecosystem. Reason being is we are so used to working in the traditional business mindset where we build and we sell to our customers. We see the products and the services that we offer as commodities that we give to the customer. But in the ecosystem world, we need to think beyond the boundaries of our own business. We need to understand what are the unmet, unarticulated needs of customer and then bring those different industries and sectors together. Now, in order to do that, people cannot have the traditional mindset of how we have seen business in the past. It needs a more dynamic, more innovative and creative mindset where they also have deep strategic thinking. Because like I said in the beginning, ecosystems are complex, they're going to be unfamiliar. In order to kind of address those two aspects, complex and unfamiliar, we need to have this deep strategic knowledge. It does not mean that you go to the granular level, but it's about understanding the end-to-end value proposition that you can create in an ecosystem for the consumer.
And in culture-wise, it's always important to have the balance of maturity, the mature thinking, plus bringing in the new ideas. Okay, that's where the diversity and inclusion comes into it. Right, you've got to have that kind of. Ultimately, we're selling to consumer. At the end of our chain, end of our ecosystem, there's a consumer, and the product we supply to that consumer these consumers are going to be very diverse and very different types, right? It's important that the product we supply to that end consumer has the input from a very diverse group of people, right? Ultimately, these people are feeding into your product in the ecosystem, and the ecosystem must represent the final consumer, and that's why it's important to have the diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, that's completely mirroring what Deepak was just saying as well about his when he was talking about building AI, because you have to build AI. The people building it have to match the users as well, and that's what you're saying when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. The people inputting into it must be as diverse as your consumer and represent them.
Yeah. I suppose though, with an ecosystem, I mean, by its very definition and by its nature, an ecosystem is lots of moving parts, if you like.
Yeah.
Isn't there inevitably there's going to be some kind of clash or at least friction there because of diversity, right? They're different companies, they're different organisations with different people in. How do you align them so you have the same culture, the same values, the same diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, well, you've got to meet a consensus, right? And the consensus is, you want to sell something ultimately to the consumer, and that's the line where you will come and get that consensus, right? Groups come in, they have different practices, they work, they have different business models, but ultimately they need to come together to sell more of that product they're creating. And it's at that point is where you will get that consensus on the cultures.
Okay, Tony, I'm going to turn to you now, and we're going to talk about risk and resilience, something that every organisation is having to face right now. Now, recent events have shone a light on how important risk mitigation is for organisations. How does this affect future partnerships, do you think?
Specifically in the context of ecosystem, the reason why I keep coming back to ecosystem is relatively new. Large tech companies who have been created in the last 10 years have been good at it. But the monoliths that we talk about, the companies that have existed for beyond 10, 20 years, for them it's a little difficult. So we need to understand what are the perceived risks in ecosystem. We need to identify risks. We need to be agile in kind of understanding what are the risks that comes when an ecosystem is being created, the different type of markets and the consumer that we serve, because you can only do so much and identify the risks that is visible to us, that we can predict these are the risks. So risk in a zero trust environment within the ecosystem with AI, with all the technologies and the business models that comes in, you can have a mitigation plan for it. But at the same time, collectively, the entire partner ecosystem needs to have an agile way of addressing the risks, understanding the mitigation, because in today's world, consumers don't feel very comfortable taking up services for which they don't feel safe. It's data privacy, it is about it's like addressing the fraud elements of it. So how do you kind of give or provide a service in a way where the customer has trust in your products and services? So yes, risk and resilience becomes another cornerstone of any kind of a partnership or an ecosystem that we want to create.
I guess how do you measure that? How do you measure that risk and resilience?
Yeah.
That's a tough one, right?
Exactly.
How do you measure your company is resilient to any future shocks that come up? I guess that current problems are supply chain and talent, doing all the work that we need to be done at the moment. And how do we measure that? And how do we protect ourselves in the future?
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned there's supply chain and talent as two risks. Are they the ones that you think are the most considerable risks right now?
I think the pandemic has created the move to tech quickly, and it needs talent to move to tech, right? All these digital services. So that's how do you measure that if you need to change direction quickly, you can bring on the talent required, necessary to build out your digital products. And that's a kind of a measure that we need to put in place.
Yeah. I think beyond talent also is like one of the things that we need to understand is to create a zero trust environment, because apart from talent, supply chain logistics risk that we have today, the cyber criminals are becoming smarter as the technologies evolve. Anything and everything that we do, it is kind of vulnerable. So in order to address that in a way that is effective to protect your consumers, we need to have a zero trust environment. And that's where technologies like AI and ML will actually feed into a lot more stronger.
And the quicker you move, the more vulnerabilities are created.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So your AI has to be keeping up with those, detecting those vulnerabilities as your technology moves quicker.
Yeah, because a lot of products and services that we're seeing in today's world are from the bleeding edge technology. They're not from cutting edge technology, right? So bleeding edge technology is not being tested fully. It's not being vetted. It's not being foolproofed in a way that other technologies are. So how do you kind of protect it? And that's where artificial intelligence and emerging technologies play a key role as well.
Yeah, so we should use the technology to monitor the change and try and predict where vulnerabilities will appear before we detect them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the speakers was telling me backstage, when it comes around to talent, for instance, that they are certainly looking more global, and I suppose having a digital ecosystem naturally feeds into that model where it's not quite outsourcing, but it's more maybe recruiting teams globally to do specific tasks. What's your take on that in terms of talent? If you can't find the talent, let's say we're here in London and we're struggling to find the talent for the roles that we need to fill, do we think we have to look globally, and can they be embedded into the organisation?
Yeah, there's two aspects. There's finding the talent globally, but also training the talent so it's fit for purpose. And we're going to have to put that stage in our talent acquisition of finding talent that might fit, but it's not quite the talent we need at that time. So having a step of training and, it's like a longer onboarding session. Rather than a day, it's weeks or months to train those people to come up to speed to fit into those teams.
But that's essential, because otherwise we are going to face that skills shortage and that skills gap.
The tech companies have to take on the responsibility of training there. But they can't assume the market is going to supply them with the talent. There's going to have to be a period of maybe a few months where you identify a candidate and you will have to train them to put into your organization.
Yeah. I think one of the alternates of the talent that few companies are exploring is during the pandemic we have seen people have understood and experienced work from home, right? So people want to work remotely. They don't want to come into office. That means they are basically available globally in the market to work for any company in any part of the world. So how do you kind of tap into that talent? Because we might have a shortage of talent in a particular country or in a particular region. But how do you tap into the global market without actually asking them to relocate to that country? And that's where the gig worker model comes into play. So a lot of them want a much more structured, secured freelance kind of workforce, where they come in, they work on emerging technologies, they build the services and the products in a secure environment, and they go back. So the overhead of retaining talent, upskilling talent, it's not constant for an organization. Yes, they are kind of coming up with new learning and development skills and programs to address the nimble workforce that they have, the agile workforce that they have. Like Paul was saying, it's like there is a need, there's a longer onboarding process now. But how much can you depend on your existing workforce? So you need to augment that with a more agile and nimble workforce.
Yeah, and the old piecemeal headhunting model just isn't fit for purpose anymore. You cannot go and find one or two people. You've got to find large teams or have a pipeline of people who have been trained up, ready for when you need them.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to start bringing this to a close. Does anyone have any questions from the floor? Yeah, there's a question at the back there. Is Tom there? Oh, no. I'll come to you in a second, Tom. Just before we get to that question, if there was one takeaway from this session, one piece of advice that you would have about digital ecosystems and what people need to bear in mind or take away from this or implement right now, what's the one thing that you would suggest, Tony?
Take the leap.
Take the leap.
I think people are too, they have the inhibition of not taking the leap. They're always experimenting in piecemeal basis. But that is not good enough, because there are tech companies who are kind of eating up the large monoliths that was built over the last 50 years. So traditional companies need to take the leap, and the ecosystem is there. It's been tried, tested, the pathway has been defined. We are in the world of ecosystem 2.0. It's not even 1.0, right? So they have to take the leap.
Paul?
And mine is, go and find those startups in those large companies, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to work with a large company and you want to utilize the reach of the large company, go and find those smaller companies within.
Okay, really good piece of advice there. Okay, good. As usual, if you could state your name and where you're from, please.
Yeah, I'm Arun Kumar. I'm for Stepstone Group of Company. My question right now is, you touched the point on the company with the monolithic for years and years. We're growing, we're moving into the ecosystem integration kind of area, with what we're evolving. As a person, for me, when I moved into the cloud kind of area for the last 8 years, from the monolithic, open up the opportunity and challenges, and everything is evolved, and every day is exploring and innovating. Is a day to day. It's not like it's not easy in the past. When I work in 15 years back, when I'm working on something get released, I never get a chance to work on that side. As a person, I can able to go and explore and innovate on day-to-day basis. But come back to the business, like you mentioned about, it's been evolved for 20 years. It's not easy things to evolve in the same actual speed. What's your view on it to run? Because we are serving for the same customer, for example, but the way how we evolve, it has to run both, otherwise we can't able to run the business. What's your view on it to run parallelly, so that we can able to go and move on? At some point we can able to reach, that's the area which I'm thinking. This is a practical scenario which I can see, of which I'm working in my...
No, it's a very good question. I think that a lot of companies are trying to address that question as a part of their strategy as well. Do I migrate or modernize my entire technology stack and then kind of go into that ecosystem space? Or do I kind of create a separate organization, like Paul was saying, the smaller units within large companies, to kind of drive this as an incubation center? So one of the positive things that has worked for a few companies that we could potentially try out in these large organizations is to create this kind of incubation units that helps us to create this ecosystem as a startup within a large organization, and then drive it as a parallel entity within the unit. The reason is, if you're going to wait for the modernization, and that's going to be a long time, because we have systems in architecture that's 25, 30 years old. It's not easy to lift and shift into the hyperscalers overnight, right? So it is a long process, the migration and the modernization. So in order to also cater to the competitive scenario in which we are today, it would be advisable to start thinking like a startup, like a venture studio. So that could accelerate the jump or the leap into ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, then we'll leave it there. Please join me in thanking Paul and Tony. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.